Hi everyone. I keep getting advertisement on social media from the Good Law Project. I don't know much about them, but I gather they are a legal lobby group that are opposed to the UK's High Court decision recently, Supreme Court decision actually regarding the status of trans rights in the UK. Um, Most people support that position. That the Supreme Court has made, and actually it is not necessarily taking away rights from trans people, it's simply determining in law the importance of biology. Um, and there's lots more ins and outs to that, which you're not going to go to into in this video. What I want to talk about is the antics of the trans lobby and why I think it has to be said that men cannot be women. They just can't. So I'm putting my cards on the table from the outset now. If you're a trans person, I'm not making this video to try and be hurtful and try and be malicious and try and stoke up animosity. That's not my intention. I'm making it because I think freedom of expression matters. I'm making it because I think that there needs to be a pushback against some of the narratives. I do acknowledge that for trans people, life can sometimes be very challenging. I'm not in their shoes. I can imagine at times, if you're listening to the media, if you're listening to the debate around it, it can seem that there are a lot of people against you. It can seem, I'm sure, lonely. I'm sure it could seem frustrating at times. Um, and I've always condemned bullying, clear cut cases of bullying. So I've never supported, for instance, just mocking trans people or engaging in that sort of cruel behavior. I've never supported that. I don't see what's productive about that at all. Um, I do have a lot of sympathy for someone who's struggling with gender dysphoria. And I know the trans lobby will say that's not always the case, but I think it is often the case. So I do have sympathy for people in that position. But there are certain things that just have to be said. A big part of this debate is live and let live. You know, how does it hurt me? What status a trans person is. Well, it doesn't actually hurt me as a man. I'm not concerned about myself so much, unless, of course, I fell foul of the thought police. And we do have a serious problem in this country with free speech at the moment. I do think it is eroding. I do think there are too many police forces gracefully abusing non-crime hate incidents legislation, wasting the resources, for example, going to people's homes because they've had some social media feud. I think that is a disgrace. And if Labour really does believe in free speech as they claim, they need to. I would actually go further and just scrap non-crime hate incidents altogether. I don't think the police have any business being involved in that. The only time I think there should be police involvement regarding social media interactions, if there is clear cut violent threats, if there is targeted vitriolic abuse of an individual, to the point where it's really destroying their life. And I'm talking there more about private individuals. I think famous people, frankly, should take some scrutiny. Um, or with issues of national security, if you have espionage activity and so on, people parroting the propaganda of a hostile foreign state, I think there would be a valid reason there for police involvement, or promoting terrorism for that matter. Someone using the wrong pronoun, I absolutely do not think there should be any police involvement in that whatsoever. It's a disgrace. Um, and then the police complain that the public have lost trust in them. That's why, one reason why. There is a lot of things around this issue that I'm not going to go into all of them in this video, but just focusing on J.K. Rowling, the vitriol that woman has received is unbelievable. I'm not going to say she's perfect. Nobody is. Um, and I know at times she's made sort of sarcastic responses, but that's just the point. They are responses. So much of this transphobia that J.K. Rowling has been accused of is simply her pushing back, defending herself. People say, why is she obsessed? Maybe it's because she feels it's important to defend herself. Maybe it's because she feels it's important to stand up for truth, and I agree with her. I believe if you do a vox pop on the street and ask someone, Someone born as a biological man, i.e., with male genitalia, can they be a woman? Most people say no, they can't. Now, legally, they could be a trans woman. They could go through a transition as an adult and be a trans woman. Um, and personally, I have known a few trans people, and I've respected them. I'm not going to go and just use the wrong pronoun just to try and get under their skin. If they have a preferred pronoun, I'll use it out of etiquette. But where I draw a line is being told, not directly, but the implications, for example, what the Good Law Project is promoting, being told that people should have the very thought control, that someone has to believe that a man is a woman because that's how they identify. I think that goes far too far. It's interfering with freedom of conscience. And this whole thing about live and let live, why are transphobes so obsessed about what's behind someone's underwear? Well, there's a few things with that. Firstly, there are real world implications. We know that. Women's sports, women's prisons. There are implications in that if someone who simply identifies the way they choose, for example, they commit a crime and they still are a biological man, they may not have had a transition, then they're sent to a woman's prison. That's obviously a danger where, their mates are changing and so on. I believe if someone commits a crime, I'm conservative on crime. I think women who commit a crime should go to prison, a serious crime. But I don't think that as part of their punishment, they should be subjected to living quarters with biological men. That's obviously a risk. So there are implications that go beyond this argument of live and let live. That argument only works if live and let live is not impacting other people, except that it is in this situation. It's a bit like, the argument the US gun lobby use of you don't like guns, don't buy them. Well, easy access to guns puts others at danger. So, live and let live it's not a flawless argument when it impacts other people. I think there's certain things that need to be heavily scrutinised. I've mentioned the freedom of speech issue. There is the point of changing language to the point of absurdity is laughed at by the majority. I mean, but it's all very well to laugh at, but there are serious implications when NHS um, vernacular gets into talking about expectant people, breastfeeding humans, etc. It's almost like women are being erased. I mean, that is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Um, because when we get into this word transphobe, it seems to me that's a catch-all for anyone who believes that biology matters. So we have a situation where anyone who believes that could potentially find themselves threatened with legislation if the Good Law Project, so-called Good Law Project, has the way. And I just find it very hypocritical to talk about bullying when they have absolutely no problem with vicious, aggressive signs at trans protests, literally reading hang turfs and misogynistic language I'm not going to repeat in this video, things involving extreme sexual violence, literally. That any straight so-called cis man saying, if I said those sort of things, I would rightly be arrested. But, trans protesters get away with it because they're an oppressed minority, supposedly. I think that's disgusting. I don't think anyone should be allowed to get away with that sort of extreme misogynistic style. Now, if you have someone invoking violence against trans people, that's clearly wrong as well. There has been violence against trans people. There was a tragic case a couple of years ago where a young trans person was murdered um, by two of her classmates. It was a high profile case. That's awful. So I don't deny that there is violence against trans people. What I'm saying is the trans lobby is not squeaky clean when it comes to aggressive and bullying antics because they often engage in it. So it's just a bit rich to preach about compassion. Plus, you know, either holding those signs or failing to condemn those signs. There are trans people like Blair White, to their credit, who call this out, and they get dismissed as traitors to the movement. Um, A bit like women who refuse to engage in misandric language get dismissed by radical feminists. Um, of course, there's been a little bit of an irony here whereby for a long time, third wave feminists did engage in some pretty misandrous attitudes. Now they find themselves, you know, facing genuine misogyny from the trans lobby. Um, and ironically, you know, us terrible men, a lot of us are, speaking up in defense of feminists because I will say that they have a right to defend biological reality when it has an implication on women. Um, there's one aspect too that I find very troubling, which is how this language about trans children. This is an oxymoron because legally in the UK you need to be 18 to have a transition. So you cannot have a 9-year old trans child. I mean, that to me is ludicrous. It's ludicrous. There's also, a situation whereby we've had teenage girls who've had mastectomies because they felt they were meant to be male. Then they reach their mid or late 20s and they've deeply regretted that. I mean, the trans lobby talks about the evils of conversion therapy, but they never talk about the fact that academics who do research into detransitioning face losing their job or at least defunding. I don't think there's been enough scope put on people who've regretted their decisions of transitioning. And I think it is deeply, deeply immoral to tell a troubled child the solution is to have a sex change. A young boy who is playing with dolls may simply be showing effeminate behavior. Um, maybe it's just gay. This idea that if a child is confused, you get some very immoral adults, in my opinion, who then try to force puberty blockers onto them and so on. I think that is deeply immoral and it should absolutely be illegal. Very dubious so-called charities like Mermaids, it's right that they lose funding. It's the sort of things they're proposing are deeply unethical. Um, really telling children they should get puberty blockers, that is sinister. I think it's absolute child abuse. And it has to be said, if someone if someone cut off their arm, the chances are they would be deemed to be deeply mentally unstable. But if they want to, frankly, mutilate their genitalia, then they are applauded, and it's all about trans rights. I think what needs to be looked at here is, I mean, as it stands, as I understand it, for someone to transition in this country, they do need to live as the opposite sex for 6 months. It's not unlikely. That's something. But trans lobby want to make this super easy. They want it. They don't want even this process. They want a situation where confused children can have a sex change. Um, I just find that deeply concerning. So I'm going to wrap this up. But, people might think why, they might challenge me and say, why does this bother me as a cis man? Interesting, for people who say they don't want to throw out labels, they're very happy throwing out the term cis. I'm not really offended by it, but I think it's a nonsense term. Um, I'm speaking out because I'm sick of the misogyny leveled against people like J.K. Rowling. I mean, the Good Law Project talks about being a millionaire. She's a multimillionaire, but there's also powerful celebrities who've jumped on the bandwagon against her, like the actor Pedro Pascal, who says he effing hates bullies, ignoring the fact he himself is engaging in misogynistic bullying by jumping on this bandwagon against J.K. Rowling. I can honestly say, I have never seen her advocate violence or genuine hate against trans people. All she has ever done is defend biological reality and push back, sometimes sarcastically, but that's all she's ever done. Recently, there's been this trend for people to say she looks like a man. Um, and she came out with a sarcastic response to the men saying I look like this. I call out your transphobia. But they were, it was this failure to introspect, this failure to see that she was so clearly being sarcastic about that. I.e., those who like to preach the loudest are often hypocrites. I don't say J.K. Rowling is perfect, but it's ironic that someone who is actually in many ways on the political left. You know, she's very critical of Trump. In many areas, she would be seen as a progressive. She's now this hate figure for the trans lobby. It's pathetic. And when you get, anything connected with Harry Potter and the Harry Potter universe, particularly in the United States, trying to phase out the very name of J.K. Rowling, that is nonsense. You cannot take away the creator from the created enterprise. It's just nonsense. You don't have to agree with her. And actually, I don't believe that Daniel Radcliffe, Emma Watson, and Rupert Grint have to agree with J.K. Rowling. But I do think it's cynical to jump on the bandwagon against her. And I give people like Ralph Fiennes um, and others credit for not jumping on that bandwagon. Look what's happened. Actors and others who have defended J.K. Rowling have found themselves subject to abuse simply for defending her right to free speech. It's not even like saying we agree with her views on the trans issue. Tom Felton recently, who played Draco Malfoy, he recently he refused to jump on that bandwagon. He found a backlash against himself. This is what happens if you speak out. Now, I don't believe that's a majority opinion. So I would argue actually when it comes to the trans lobby, there is overdue influence. Frankly, you have a small minority of people who have overdue influence in terms of language policing. Now, this doesn't mean I think they should be kept down in silence or something like that. You know, I don't follow the tactics of the trans lobby. I believe they should be allowed to have an opinion. If they want to disagree with J.K. Rowling, they've got every right to do that. And like I said, I am not in their shoes. I do not know what it is like to be a trans person. And I know, for instance, there's higher suicide rates and so on, but I make no apology for saying the things that I've said. I do not think that children should be anywhere near puberty blockers. I do not think that people should be forced to believe that a biological man can ever be a woman in the true sense of being a woman. Um, and I think there is something unsettling about the fact that academics who want to look into, for example, rates of detransitioning, find themselves smeared as transphobes and lose funding. So, where's the real power dynamic here? Is it in those who speak out and say, actually, there are issues here, or is it in those who scream about transphobia? I mean, if this country was so transphobic and kept trans people down so much, they wouldn't even be allowed to protest. They would be arrested simply for being trans. There's a lot of hyperbole in the so-called oppression. If a trans person is subject to violence, then the perpetrator will rightly be punished. But I will never, ever, ever apologize for stating my view that biology does matter and men cannot be women. They just can't. No amount of browbeating people, no amount of trying to force language change, no amount of insisting that gender identity should be put on the same par as sexual biological reality. I just don't think it's. I just don't think that that holds up to scrutiny when it comes to how society should approach this. I think, yeah. So I stand by J.K. Rowling absolutely, and when I see the likes of the Good Law Project jump on the bandwagon, try to silence her with their cowardly tactics, it really discredits them as an organisation. Um, Finally, if you're a trans person, you might think I'm full of it. You might want to argue with me on these things. That's fine. I'm not going to censor your comment, but you cannot force me to believe that A equals B. You just can't. You could believe whatever you want, and I can believe whatever I want. That's that's liberty of conscience. That is extremely important in a free society.